It's January 20th, 2025. The United States of America is getting a new president. Well, not really brand new. The 45th man is back in the Oval as the 47th. The red half of America is celebrating, leaving the blue side of the aisle wondering where it all went wrong. But as the rest of the world sends in congratulatory messages, the new president has no time to check the mail for those. Instead, he is on his desk signing an executive order, one that is about to send a major shockwave across the entire world.
So this is a big one.
When President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14169, mandating a 90-day suspension of all U.S. foreign development assistance program, he said his desire was to make sure the United States of America was only spending its money on things that aligned with American interests and values. The Trump administration claimed that the existing aid structure destabilized global peace, a remark that was immediately criticized by his political opponents. But the days that followed uncovered one of the most shocking stories in recent times, particularly with regards to this body, USAID.
Mr. Roman, are you aware that we are sending $40 million a week to the Taliban?
Yes, sir. We have assisted Al-Shabaab in Somalia. There's been instances of the Hamzi network in Sudan, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Kataib al-Hezbollah, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams in Syria. Dozens of terror organizations have received indirect assistance from U.S. foreign aid.
But hang on now. Sending aid money to terror-linked organizations is not the only jaw-dropping revelation from these investigations. It was later revealed that while the United States government, through this body, sent lots of money to poor countries to help in their fight against AIDS and other deadly diseases, they also funded journalists and media personalities in those poor countries. They used paid activists and journalists to shape the narrative in those countries, literally taking over control of the media space and labeling any other source of information as disinformation or misinformation agents. They were paid fact-checkers who ran these operations in poor African countries, making sure the people only have access to what their Western overlord deemed them worthy to know. Some of the money was also used to interfere in local politics, arrange fake protests that sometimes led to regime change. Most of these operations were carried out with the help of activists and NGOs operating in those poor countries. However, this is nothing new. The United States Agency for International Development has had a dual legacy since its founding in 1961. While this body has coordinated billions of dollars in economic and humanitarian aid, the classified documents have shown how these assistance usually come with strings attached. Strings that are sometimes used to remove legitimate governments from power and even force the will of the United States on unsuspecting countries. I want to tell you the controversial story of USAID. I'll show you case studies from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Egypt, Somalia, and Ethiopia. We'll go all the way back to the beginning to unravel this story of corruption, political manipulations, and interference. Buckle up, it's sure going to be a wild ride.
USAID's U.S. Agency for International Development was closed to personnel on Monday.
I've had a lot of requests from people who want to learn how to express or communicate their ideas in the form of full-length videos like I do. The kind you're proud to share, the kind that captivates your audience without spending hours learning how to use complex editing tools. InVideo AI enables you to do just that in the most seamless, intuitive way possible, irrespective of whatever skill level you're at. Just type in the idea you want to create a video about and watch as it transforms into a fully structured video. And the best part, you can refine it effortlessly using simple text commands. If you want to add your voice and start with a joke, just type it in. This is pretty game-changing. Unlike traditional video tools that come with steep learning curves and only solve bits of the process, InVideo AI is your all-in-one creative partner. It removes the friction, puts you in the director's seat, and lets you focus entirely on your vision, while it takes care of the heavy lifting. You can try InVideo AI for free today. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. Click on this link in the description box below to take full advantage of this offer while it lasts. Thank you InVideo for sponsoring this video. Now, let's jump right back into our story. The story of USAID is one of America's grand experiments in global influence. It began amidst the chaos of World War II. As Europe and Asia lay in ruins, economies shattered and population starving, the United States was faced with a difficult decision: retreat into isolation as it had done after World War I, or step forward as a global leader with the responsibility of bringing order to the new world. This was more than just an economic decision. With Nazi Germany defeated, there was now a new battle for the soul of the post-war world, a struggle between democracy and communism. President Harry Truman saw the writing on the wall. The Soviet Union, once a reluctant ally, had turned into a growing adversary, spreading its ideology all across Eastern Europe and beyond. The US needed to counter the message being spread by the Soviets. A military move would have been disastrous considering the arms race, with everyone looking for an opportunity to test the atomic bomb on its adversary. So, a different route was chosen. The Marshall Plan, also known as the European Recovery Program, was launched in 1948 as America's first great experiment in using aid to shape the world. The idea was pretty simple: create stable conditions for democratic governments to survive in Western and Southern Europe. Billions flowed into about 17 European countries, including Austria, Belgium, Greece, Italy, and the Netherlands. This money was used to rebuild cities, industries, and lives. But the United States was not doing this out of generosity. Far from it. The goal was to ensure that war-torn nations would embrace democracy and capitalism instead of falling under what the Americans called the Soviet shadow. The plan worked. Western Europe was reborn, its economy thriving, but the success of this Marshall Plan raised a bigger question. Should America's aid be limited to Europe, or did it have a role to play in the broader world? Truman's advisors, looking at Asia, Africa, and Latin America, saw nations that were just emerging from colonial rule, most of them fragile, unstable, and susceptible to communist influence. So, in 1949, Truman announced the Point 4 program, a bold initiative to extend American aid beyond Europe to help developing nations build their economies and, of course, infrastructure. But this was not going to cut it. Aid programs were scattered across multiple agencies, each with its own bureaucracy and agenda. The US needed a single, streamlined organization to lead its global development efforts. The perfect answer to this came in 1961.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of your ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
The Cold War was at its peak. President Kennedy understood that America's power would not be measured only in missiles and armies, but in its ability to win hearts and minds. In fact, he famously declared in his inaugural address that,
to those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves for whatever period is required.
in this spirit of helping the developing world help themselves, the USAID was born. It was the belief of President J.F. Kennedy that aiding poorer countries was the most humane thing to do. The decades that followed saw USAID become one of the highest donors in the world, with its presence in over 100 countries, with targets in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Western Europe. But all that is just on the surface. The US Agency for International Development was not just an aid organization, it was a tool of diplomacy, one that was often used to further the interest of the United States. Now, here's what I mean. In Latin America during the 1960s and 70s, aid was often tied to anti-communist regimes supporting governments that aligned with US interests, even if they were authoritarian and corrupt. The USAID soon became a tool of American imperialism, a means of exerting economic control under the guise of generosity. The most interesting part of that operation was carried out by the CIA. The Cold War was a period of political and military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from the end of World War II until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. During this time, the United States and Soviet Union were the two superpowers, with the one being capitalist and the other communist. Although there was no direct physical combat between the two countries, both supported opposing sides in many proxy wars in the height of this rivalry. As the war raged on, US foreign aid became a tool of American geopolitical strategy, and USAID was at the center of this effort. Washington viewed economic assistance as a means to shore up allies, sway unallied nations, and contain the spread of communism. However, some economies that got caught up in the middle suffered severely as a result. One of such was Somalia.
Good evening. We begin tonight with what President Bush calls a difficult and dangerous mission to save lives in Somalia.
The year was 1974. Deep in the middle of the Cold War, Ethiopia, which had been the United States' most trusted partner in the Horn of Africa, was ruled by this emperor, Haile Selassie. The Lion of Judah, as he was called, had stood tall for years, yet his reign was marred with corruption, human rights violation, and repression. Across the border was Somalia, a favored ally of the Soviet Union. Moscow poured weapons and military training into the hands of Siad Barre, the country's authoritarian leader. The Horn of Africa was divided, Ethiopia and America on the one side, Somalia and the Soviet Union on the other. Then something shocking happened. The people of Ethiopia got tired of their emperor, and from nowhere came a revolution in 1974. Within months, the old empire was gone. The military junta known as the Derg seized power, overthrowing Haile Selassie and dragging him from his imperial palace. With the emperor's fall, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The United States was effectively expelled from Ethiopia as the Derg regime shifted its allegiance to the Soviet Union and Cuba. The new government adopted communist policies, making it ideologically opposed to the United States. Watching with keen interest from the sidelines were the Soviets, always eager for a stronger foothold in Africa. They saw their opportunity and took it. By the time Ethiopia formally expelled the US military personnel and shut down American installations, including Kadni Station in 1977, the Soviets had moved in, replacing the Americans as Ethiopia's primary military and economic backer. Moscow showered the Derg with weapons, military advisors, and financial aid. Soon enough, Ethiopia became not just an ally now, but a gateway to the Red Sea and a dominant power in the region. Somalia, on the other hand, was becoming an unreliable partner to the Soviets. Siad Barre's government, though socialist in name, was more nationalist than ideological. His pursuit of a greater Somalia through territorial expansion made him unpredictable. When he made the decision to invade Ethiopia's Ogaden region, an arid and contested land inhabited by ethnic Somalis, the Soviets decided to cut him off. Moscow sent weapons, military advisors, and Cuban troops to defend the Derg regime against Somalia. Siad Barre, the Somali strongman, watched in fury. He had been left out in the cold, betrayed by his Soviet patrons. Seeing his frustration with the Soviets, the United States offered this dictator a shoulder to cry on, and this marked the beginning of an unholy affair between the US and Siad Barre. The United States, recognizing an opportunity to counter Soviet influence in the Horn of Africa, funneled hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to Somalia, eager to maintain a presence on the Red Sea's shores. By 1980, a key deal had been struck. The US secured access to the Berbera port, a critical foothold on the Gulf of Aden. This was a calculated move, positioning American forces within the reach of the oil-rich Middle East. Somalia, once a Soviet pawn, was now in Washington's orbit. But things were not really rosy. Even though the US continued to pump aid into Somalia, ignoring all the human rights abuses of Siad Barre, the money was never enough to stabilize the country. The IMF and World Bank imposed structural adjustment programs in Somalia, worsening economic conditions for its people. Bela, desperate to maintain his grip on power, turned increasingly violent, targeting his own people. His regime carried out massacres, especially against the Isa clan in the north, dropping bombs on civilian cities like Hargeisa. The US, preoccupied with Cold War strategies, did nothing to stop this man. But the empire was crumbling. By 1991, after years of economic collapse, military uprisings, and international neglect, Siad Barre was finally overthrown. Somalia fell into chaos, spiraling into a civil war that would last for decades. There was no government, no stability, only warlords battling for control over what was left of this once great nation. By the time the Cold War ended, Somalia was officially a failed state. In the early 90s, as famine and conflict ravaged the remains of this war-torn country, the world finally took notice.
I have given the order to move a substantial American force into Somalia.
American troops hoping to safeguard the delivery of food and medicine to help turn this crisis around.
In 1992, under the banner of humanitarian intervention, the United States returned. Operation Restore Hope was launched with the goal of delivering food and aid to starving civilians. But the mission quickly turned into something darker.
I have seen with my own eyes dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. There were at least 2 U.S. helicopters confirmed shot down.
A conflict with Somali militias leading in the disastrous Battle of Mogadishu in 1993. 18 American soldiers were killed, along with over 1,000 Somalis. The world watched in horror as American bodies were dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. But the horror didn't stop here. There was another episode that happened in similar fashion, but this time in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was 1960, and the newly independent Congo was supposed to be the jewel of post-colonial Africa, a land of vast mineral wealth, but the dream was short-lived.
Combattants de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais.
Patrice Lumumba, the country's first elected prime minister, was a firebrand nationalist, openly leaning toward the Soviet Union in a world divided by ideology. This was enough to put him in the crosshairs of Washington. The CIA wasted no time in identifying Lumumba as a prime target for a covert operation. After months of Western manufactured unrest, Lumumba was captured, tortured, and assassinated. His body dissolved in acid to erase all traces. In the chaos that followed, a young army officer named Joseph Desire Mobutu, once a journalist trained in Belgium, emerged as a trusted friend of the West. He had worked with the CIA during the Lumumba crisis, and for that, he was rewarded handsomely. By 1965, Mobutu had seized power in a coup, styling himself as the undisputed ruler of independent Congo, a country he later renamed as Zaire. Mobutu adopted a flamboyant image, but beneath these theatrics was a well-oiled machine running on US dollars. For over 3 decades, Washington treated Mobutu as their man in Africa, pouring an estimated $12 billion in aid money into his regime. From the 1960s through the 1980s, Zaire was one of the largest recipients of American aid in sub-Saharan Africa. Officially, the money was meant to stabilize Zaire and prevent Soviet expansion. In reality though, it was Mobutu's personal war chest. Secret payments were funneled to ensure Mobutu's loyalty. He was paid directly, sometimes in suitcases of cash, for hosting American intelligence operations and allowing Zaire to be a staging ground for US interventions in Angola and other hotspots. The Pentagon kept Mobutu's army well equipped, not because he needed it to fight any foreign enemies, but because a strong military ensured he remained in power. While billions were allocated for roads, hospitals, and education, much of it disappeared. Mobutu built a vast network of offshore accounts, Swiss mansions, and luxury estates in Europe, all while his people starved at home. For the US, Mobutu was a necessary evil, one that was useful to his Cold War operations in Africa. Like when Angola descended into civil war, Washington used Zaire as a supply route for anti-communist rebels. Mobutu played host to mercenaries, CIA operatives, and South African special forces, all while his own country suffered under his kleptocracy. Even when his extravagance and corruption became impossible to ignore, the Reagan administration doubled down, calling him, quote, voice of moderation in Africa. A 1982 to 1986 USAID officer in Zaire recalled that, quote, for the Reagan White House, Zaire was uniquely and strategically placed to support US interests in the Cold War, indicating that strategic importance overrode concerns about governance. By the late 1980s, Mobutu's usefulness was waning. The Cold War was ending, and with it, the blank checks. When the Berlin Wall fell, so did the need to prop up anti-communist strongmen. In Washington, policymakers began seeing Mobutu not as a reliable ally, but as an embarrassing relic. With US support drying up, Mobutu's regime crumbled. Rebels led by Laurent Désiré Kabila marched towards Kinshasa in 1997. Mobutu, who was suffering from cancer, abandoned by his foreign backers, fled into exile, dying a lonely death in Morocco months later. The man who once controlled a nation the size of Western Europe had become a ghost, his billions hoarded in foreign vaults, never to reach the people he ruled. The DRC, just like Somalia, has been fighting one battle after another ever since then. But if you think these two countries had the game rigged against them, wait until you hear the story of Egypt. Egypt has been one of the largest recipients of US foreign aid since the late 1970s, consistently receiving $1 to $2 billion per year, a combination of military and economic aid. However, USAID's involvement in Egypt has often been criticized for advancing US and Western economic agendas that may not align with the need of ordinary Egyptians. In the 1980s and 1990s, as Egypt's government debt mounted, the US and international financial institutions pushed Egypt to adopt drastic reforms like privatization of state enterprises, deregulation, and opening to global trade. USAID played a direct role in this transformation. According to Jason Hickel, Washington used aid as leverage to remake Egypt's economy. By the mid-1990s, USAID was disbursing about $815 million annually in economic aid explicitly to encourage free market policies in Egypt. In 1991, Egypt signed structural adjustment programs with the IMF and World Bank. Around the same time, USAID conditioned its support on compliance with these reforms. According to reports, USAID even funded consultants to influence Egyptian policies. For example, subsidizing a shakeup of Egypt's cabinet in 1996 to install a prime minister, this guy, Kamal Ganzouri, who was open to the idea of faster privatization of state assets. When the new team took office, USAID openly praised Egypt's government for, quote, increasing competition in the financial sector and accelerating privatization. USAID further offered cash transfer programs that essentially rewarded Egypt's government for policy changes. Example, $200 million each year in handouts to Egyptian policymakers to encourage tariff reductions and the privatization of healthcare, education, and more than 300 state companies. That is, USAID was literally bribing Egyptian lawmakers to work against their own country. This amounted to direct incentivizing of specific economic outcomes favorable to US economic interests, such as ensuring a market for US goods by lowering Egyptian trade barriers. As a result of these policy shifts, essential services became more expensive for Egyptians. Wealth concentrated among a new elite who could buy former state assets. By 2010, Egypt's poverty and unemployment were still high. Resentment of economic hardship was one of the factors that led to the 2011 Egyptian revolution. But now let's pause here for a second. If USAID was just donating to the development of these countries and not really involved in their local politics, who then was responsible for these operations that effectively tied aid money to specific US interests? One of the most persistent controversies in USAID's history is this alleged collaboration with US intelligence agencies, especially the CIA. Over the decades, Investigative journalists and former officials have uncovered multiple instances where USAID programs and personnel overlapped with covert intelligence operations. This has fueled perceptions that USAID sometimes serves as a quote cover for US intelligence programs. In the 1960s and 1970s, USAID's own Office of Public Safety, known as OPS, partnered with the CIA to train foreign police and internal security forces around the world. But beyond training foreign security forces, USAID has been linked to covert political operations. During the Vietnam War, USAID personnel were embedded in the US pacification programs that aimed to win local support and gather intelligence in rural areas. Field funds in Vietnam were sometimes controlled by the Joint Country Intelligence Team, which included the CIA station chief. This was according to first-hand accounts. Decades later, USAID would again blur the line between aid and espionage in places like Cuba, where it ran secret programs to spark unrest. This blending of roles led a Cuban government official to label the USAID as, quote, the new CIA, a sentiment echoed by other regimes that have expelled USAID missions for alleged intrusive activities. Even though USAID officials have denied being a CIA front, the evidence tells a different story. Now, while all this suggests a controversial history that some might say should be left in the past, USAID has not changed much. Recent investigations into the activities of the agency have uncovered shocking details about the aid money this agency sends across the world. There were reports of the Biden administration's USAID office funding abortion-related programs in Africa, when USAID directed hundreds of millions of dollars to discourage Afghan farmers from cultivating poppies for opium production. What the officials didn't factor in was the possibility that these funds may have inadvertently supported poppy cultivation, potentially benefiting the Taliban. Yeah, there are now reports of USAID sending millions of dollars to Taliban, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and other terror-linked organizations. And there was also the Cuban experiment we talked about earlier. Between 2009 and 2012, USAID funded a covert operation to create a Cuban Twitter-like platform called Zunzuneo. The initiative aimed to incite political dissent in Cuba, a blatant violation of Cuban sovereignty. Investigations have also revealed how USAID reportedly awarded $110,000 in 2021 to Helping Hand for Relief and Development, a Michigan-based charity accused of having ties to terrorist organizations in South Asia. Records indicate that USAID funded the college education of a certain Anwar al-Awlaki, who later became an Al-Qaeda terrorist. He allegedly misrepresented his birthplace to qualify for the funding. This further highlighted potential lapses in the agency's oversight. Now, I want to be very clear that this agency, USAID, has done some good. It is not all bad when it comes to its donations. But when you take some time to reflect on why they push out the, quote, doing good with aid narrative, you begin to see all the other not so good activities perpetrated by officials of the agency. And then you kind of begin to wonder, was this all a disguise? Remember, when the US government states that it uses foreign aid as a foreign policy tool to further its interests abroad, there is nothing more clear than that. The problem sometimes is seeing too much good in charity, especially when the giver needs your natural resources to survive.